I'm going to start by acknowledging that we live, work and play on Noongar country, and that we respect and acknowledge that the deep connection the people have with the land and water, and also that we pay our respects to elders, past, present and future. So Bush Heritage is an organisation that works right across Australia. We're an NGO, so a national organisation, and we work in the Western Australia and also above Perth. We have a few properties there. So we're working in conservation, and we also work with Aboriginal people across the top of Australia, also in the south but more so in the north. So today I'm just going to run through very quickly the process that we use to create fauna habitat, or try and create fauna habitat, and how we monitor that habitat on some of the properties that we work in the Gondwana Link area. But first of all, because we're a science-based organisation, we actually use that science structure to study the behaviour of the natural world, and through observation and experimentation, but also in the experience that I've had. I love this word alchemy, because it's a seemingly magical process by which we're transforming those paddocks that were paddocks, they were productive paddocks, into habitat for fauna. So we've got lots of different plants growing, native plants, and we are getting rid of some of the weeds. And although we put in the best science, as you'll see, there's always surprises, and we're still not really good at it. So we've done what we can, but this is the process we use anyway. So this is the area we're working in, and it's between the Stirling Range and the Fitzgerald River National Parks. And you'll see the large areas in the middle are the nature reserves that we're building around. And of course we've got the Stirlings down here and the Fitzgerald up there. So the idea is for Bush Heritage at the moment is we're working in that central zone, and we're just trying to consolidate and create, I suppose, opportunities out there for fauna to recolonise some of those areas. So so the orange, the yellow and the green properties, they all have they're all in private conservation ownership, and they all have some sort of restoration on them at different stages. So it first started, I think, way back in 2002. So we've been going for a little while now, and the last bits that Bush Heritage were involved in was in 2014. And we've been involved in roughly about 1,300 hectares of restoration out there, which, as Keith showed on his map, is not a lot, but it's very resource intensive, and it'd be great to expand what we're doing. So the big question for me is how do we recreate fauna habitat on those cleared, on that cleared country? So this particular picture here is our Baringa Reserve before it was revegetated. And this part now belongs to Greening Australia, but I used to do all the bird surveys up there. So what you can see there is a paddock that was cropped maybe a year or two before that, and it had been left to go fallow. So we're left with a lot of grasses and some other weedy plants in there, a few rock piles and the occasional remnant tree. So that provides habitat for what we call agricultural increase of species. So I'd record a lot of things like galahs, magpies, willy wagtails, Richard pipits, and we'd find the occasional reptile hiding away in some of these rock piles that had been, of course the rocks had all been cleared from the paddocks and piled into, put into piles, and you'd find the occasional goanna that would be living in these paddocks amongst these rock piles. And so it was great habitat for those species. However, my question was, how do we get things like the bushrat, which is one of our native bushrats, Rattus fuscipes, how do we get animals like that back into that landscape? Because as we saw from Keith's picture, it's way out of whack. There's far too much cleared country out there for these animals to survive in any long-term sense. So that was my big question, is how do we transfer transform these landscapes into something that these animals can recolonise. So to actually find that out, so to answer these really big questions, we started really compiling a list of fauna that we expected to return to the land after restoration. So that was my first starting point, and this information came from both myself and other people that have done lots of work across the south coast on fauna and describing their habitats, and from published literature. So from that information I was able to compile a list of about 72 bird species, 21 mammals and 34 reptile species that we could reasonably expect to recolonise these areas if we did the restoration the way they liked it. So that was a really big challenge. So thinking more about that, I then delved deeper into the literature, and I must say I couldn't find very much, but what were the resource needs of these particular species that we would have to duplicate in the restored areas if we were to get any success for them to recolonise. So that was the second step. And the third step, of course, is to, once we've got a list of or whatever those resources are, how we incorporate those into the restoration design. So that was the next step. And just as an example, so looking at the 34 reptiles that we expect to return, you can see that about 80% of them use litter and they live under rocks or use rocks in some way. Now, as you saw in the previous slide, all the rocks have been cleared from the paddocks and they've been put into piles, which were also harbouring cats and rabbits and foxes if they were big enough piles. So we had quite a big job in front of us. So how do we recreate the litter? And of course, a lot of their animals also use burrows. And as I think, I can't remember who mentioned in their talk, it might have been Tim, that the soil gets compacted through farming activities. So we were dealing with compacted soils as well. So we had to think about all that. And of course, abandoned stick ant nests are great fauna habitat, so mammals and reptiles use them. And we were hoping they'd come back, and they have. And of course, other ant nests, and we needed to put in trees that shed bark and things like that. So a lot of things to think about just in the reptiles. So we did this for the mammals and the birds as well. And what I came up with was a simplified, probably more practical way of dealing with this and looking at all the different guilds, so insectivores, nectarivores, etc., and having a look at all the different elements that we would try and recreate in these areas we were restoring for as many species as possible that we could. And of course, the obvious one is for honey possums, that we had to make sure we had in our seed mix enough plant species that they were going to have a food source 12 months of the year, or the honey possums just wouldn't survive in those areas. Also, of course, I've already mentioned rock piles and the creation of soil heaps, which was done at the time of sowing the seeds. You'll see a photo of that coming up. And I suppose also what we needed to do was look at things like invertebrates and how can we create habitat for invertebrates. So we've got food source for the insectivores, etc. And that's terrestrial invertebrates as well as the arboreal ones. So that's what we based our restoration on. And of course, the next step was to carry out the revegetation. So we had 3 contractors that we've been working with over the last couple of decades, I guess, doing this restoration work for us. And I've tried my hardest to get these elements considered at the point of seed, right at the point of seed collection. So we're looking at getting a wide variety of species into the seed mix. And also they're very, very keen on putting in the right seed mix for the right soil type. So that's all taken into consideration as well. And then of course at the bottom there, we've got a bit of an example of some of the very neat and tidy habitat islands that were put out. This was done before seeding, so they'd actually seed around these habitat islands. So we took advantage of all the rock piles, and we had a truck out there, and we redistributed a lot of the rocks. We took advantage of having vegetation that was cleared from a fence line that we had to replace, and we got that transported and put back into these areas. Because as you saw in that first paddock scene, and this one up here, there's not a lot of microhabitat out there. So giving a bit of a helping hand, because it will take decades for that to develop naturally. The next important thing that we've been doing is monitoring. So I've set up a very extensive monitoring program out there. So we do regular systematic monitoring of all the restoration sites, and we have control sites as well outside those areas. And we go back each year, and we're trying to track the not only the growth of the plants and their strata, or the structure of the plant community that develops that we've actually replaced, but we try and track which animals are coming back and how they're using those areas. So we don't work much with invertebrates, but we do very basic invertebrate surveys, but mostly we're focusing on vertebrate fauna. And we also monitor the vegetation, and we do canopy health and also soil health. So we use things like remote sensing technology as well to help us with tracking the development of the vegetation. So we use sound recorders for bats and birds, and we found 5 species of bat use these restored areas. And we use a lot of volunteers, obviously, when we're doing this work, so it's fairly labour intensive. The impact of our efforts, and this is something that we're very keen to communicate, and we've done a lot of monitoring work on this. And I'm not going to show any graphs or anything on this, but all the data's there if anyone's interested. So I'm not going to read all that out, but basically we have increased the extent of vegetation out there, obviously, because we've been doing restoration. And I'll say it is acting similar to Mallee Heath. It doesn't look like it, but it's acting similar in a similar way. And black glove wallabies have come back into the restored areas. They come back very fast within the first couple of years. And we found that the bird activity is actually higher in the restored areas than the reference sites, and which is to be expected because we've got dynamic growing vegetation and with lots of resources in there for the different bird species. So we've got malleefowl, which has surprised us immensely. So we've got a very, very active, at least one pair of malleefowl working on Monjabut North, and they're in 5-year-old vegetation with a lot of acacias in there, so obviously they're getting provided with a lot of leaf litter. But we don't know if they're hatching chicks, we know that, we've got photographs of them. As for if those chicks are surviving, we're not quite sure. But Carnaby's cockatoos are now feeding in the 6-year-old vegetation, and we've had a very generous donor that's given us some money to enhance feeding habitat for Carnaby's cockatoos. So what have we learnt? We've learnt that we actually know very little about reproducing these plant communities in these old landscapes. It is really hard work, and what we put in the first pass of that seeding stays there, and it's there for decades and decades, which is not like other parts of the world, other parts of Western Australia, some of the younger landscapes, the more dynamic landscapes. They don't sort themselves out. What we put in just grows, and it stays like that for decades and decades, and it doesn't come back on its own. Depending on how much farming activity there's been, it certainly doesn't come back on its own. So we know next to nothing about how to reintroduce most of our flora species. So Libby Sanderford has just finished doing the last flora survey and vegetation survey on our Baringa property, And we have 934 species now recorded from 10,000 hectares, which is phenomenal. So, and we know how to put back about less than 20% of those. So we're really good at putting back canopy, mid-story, even lower story. But the ground covers, the forbs, the sedges, that eludes us. We just haven't managed that so far. And they're a really important component of those plant communities out there. And there's a sweet spot, somewhere around 3,000 to 15,000 plant stems per hectare that provides the best fauna habitat. And if you want to know more about that, ask me later. And eucalypts rule. They'll grow anywhere, wherever we put them, and they're really successful. So one of the experiments, and to the detriment of other plants. So what we're going to do on our next project is to just sow the understory and then put in the eucalypts later as seedlings, hand planting them. So that's one of the experiments for later. So I can't talk to you about fauna because I've run out of time, but I just want to thank the many partners, many partners and supporters and volunteers that have made this work possible. And thank you all for listening.